Hey everyone, just a quick reminder. Only about 25% of you watching are subscribed to the channel. If you're enjoying the content, hitting that subscribe button would really help the channel grow. And while you're at it, smash that like button too. It helps a ton, and lets me know you're enjoying the content. Thanks for being here, and let's dive into the story. I didn't know what to expect when Dad announced we were leaving the city. One minute I was a normal senior at Ridgeview High, planning to endure my last year of high school with minimal embarrassment. The next, I was crammed into the passenger seat of a rattling U-Haul truck, staring at snow-covered mountains through the bug-splattered windshield. "Boys," Dad said, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "This is the life. Look at that view. Nothing but nature." Dylan, my 14-year-old brother, was sprawled out in the back seat, headphones glued to his ears. He pulled one earbud out. "Nature's cool and all, but does it have Wi-Fi?" Mom laughed from the front. "It'll be good for all of us to unplug a little." "Speak for yourself," I muttered. "I like electricity." The truck bounced as we turned onto a gravel road, the forest thickening around us. After what felt like an eternity of driving, we finally pulled into the clearing where our new house stood. And, wow, I hated to admit it, but it was awesome. A sprawling log cabin with a wraparound porch and a massive stone chimney. It looked like something out of a postcard. "Home sweet home," Dad announced, cutting the engine. "What do you think?" "It's like if Pinterest threw up on a lumberjack," I said, climbing out. "Ryan," Mom scolded, but even she was smiling. Dylan stumbled out after me, staring up at the towering pine trees. "This is way cooler than our old neighborhood," he admitted. We spent the rest of the day unloading boxes, dragging furniture into the house, and arguing over which bedrooms belonged to who. By the time the last box was in, we were all too tired to argue anymore. The fire Dad had built in the hearth crackled warmly as we ate pizza straight from the box. "Tomorrow we'll explore," Dad said. "Fishing, hiking, maybe even hunting." Dylan looked up from his slice. "Are there bears here?" Dad grinned. "Of course. That's why we've got rifles." Mom rolled her eyes. "You'll scare the boys." "Nope," Dad said, leaning back in his chair. "They need to learn how to handle themselves out here. Nature isn't all sunsets and rainbows." He wasn't kidding. The next day, Dad hauled us into the forest, teaching us how to set traps, recognize animal tracks, and build makeshift shelters. As much as I wanted to groan, I secretly enjoyed it. There was something cool about learning survival skills, like being in a real-life episode of Man vs. Wild. But the fun came to a screeching halt on Monday when school started. Dylan and I both stared at the sprawling building that would be our new high school. "Ready for this?" I asked him as we climbed out of my new 4x4 truck, a rusted-out beast Dad and I had picked up from a local seller. "Nope," Dylan said flatly. "Let's get this over with." The day went about as well as a first day could. Teachers mispronounced my name during roll call, Dylan got lost on his way to biology, and I managed to embarrass myself by dropping my lunch tray in the cafeteria. Standard high school misery. But then came the strange part. During my last class, the teacher handed out a stack of papers, rules, safety guidelines, schedules. Nothing out of the ordinary until I got to the yellow sheet at the bottom. "What's this?" I asked the girl sitting next to me. She looked up from her phone and shrugged. "Town rules." "Town rules?" She snorted. "You're new, huh? Yeah, just don't break them. People who do usually don't last long." Before I could press her for details, the bell rang. I folded the note into my pocket and forgot about it until dinner. "So, how was your first day?" Mom asked, passing me the mashed potatoes. "It was fine," I said. "Met a few people. Teachers seem okay." Dylan, who was never subtle, blurted out, "I got this weird note with rules on it. Did you get one, Ryan?" "Oh yeah," I said, fishing it out. "What's the deal with this?" Dad took the paper and began reading aloud. 1. Stay indoors after midnight. Okay, that's just common sense. 2. If you happen to be out after midnight, get indoors or in a car. They won't be able to smell you. He frowned. Smell you? Mom glanced up from her plate. What does that mean? 3. If the radio comes on randomly after dark, grab a weapon. They're close. Dad's voice had taken on an edge. And finally, 4. Bring your pets in at night. Dylan laughed nervously. Is this a joke? Like a town prank? Doesn't sound like a joke, Dad said, folding the paper. Sounds like we just moved to a town with a pest problem. What are they? Nobody had an answer. Dad shrugged it off, saying, probably just local folklore to scare kids. Nothing to worry about. But that night, as the forest outside our cabin grew dark, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. Who or what were they? The next few days were uneventful, at least as far as small-town life goes. Dad kept busy tinkering around the house, making sure our generator and security system were in top shape. Mom started decorating the cabin, filling it with enough rustic charm to give a log furniture catalog a run for its money. Dylan and I settled into school, making friends and learning the town's quirks. One thing was clear. Breckenridge wasn't like the city. People were friendlier, sure, but there was this unspoken tension that hung in the air, like everyone was walking on eggshells. It wasn't obvious at first, but the more I paid attention, the more I noticed it. Shop owners closed early, even on weekends. Kids my age never hung out late. And when I asked my new friends about the note with the rules, they either brushed it off or got weirdly quiet. I didn't think much of it until Thursday night. It started innocently enough. Dad had convinced us all to watch an old Western movie in the living room. He had the whole setup, popcorn, blankets, and his enthusiastic commentary about how they don't make them like this anymore. Dylan was glued to his phone, occasionally grunting in acknowledgement while Mom laughed at Dad's bad jokes. Halfway through the movie, I got up to grab a soda from the kitchen. That's when I noticed it. The faint hum of static coming from the radio we'd set up on the counter. At first, I thought it was just a loose connection, but then the static shifted, warping into a low, garbled voice. I froze, a shiver crawling up my spine. Dad, I called out. The radio's on. What? He came into the kitchen, frowning. I didn't touch it. It just turned on by itself. He stared at it for a moment, then unplugged it. The static cut off immediately. Cheap wiring, he muttered. Probably picking up interference from the generator. But his expression told me he didn't believe that. Not entirely, anyway. The next morning at school, I decided to bring up the rules with my new friends, mostly out of curiosity. During lunch, I sat down with a group of guys I'd started hanging out with. Nick, a loudmouth hockey player, Tyler, a self-proclaimed stoner, and James, the quiet one who always seemed a little too serious. Okay, so real talk, I said, setting my tray down. What's the deal with the rules? Nick laughed, almost choking on his soda. Oh man, the new guy's finally asking the big questions. They're real, Tyler said, his voice deadpan. Super real. Don't break them. Yeah, okay, I said, rolling my eyes. But seriously, what's the point? Are they like an old town legend or something? James looked up from his sandwich, his face unusually pale. They're not a legend. The table fell silent. Even Nick, who never shut up, seemed uncomfortable. Wait, you guys are serious? I asked, glancing between them. Tyler shrugged. Look, man, just follow the rules, all right? Don't be the idiot who thinks he's smarter than the town. People have disappeared. What do you mean, disappeared? James stared at me. Exactly what it sounds like. Stay inside after midnight. And if the radio turns on, well, you better listen to your dad. I opened my mouth to ask more, but the bell rang, cutting the conversation short. As we packed up, Nick slapped me on the back. Don't sweat it, dude. Just another day in paradise, right? But James didn't laugh. He just shook his head and walked away. That night, I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. After dinner, I sat on the porch, staring out into the woods. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows across the trees. It was quiet. Too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Dad came out carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed me one and sat down beside me. "What's on your mind, kid?" "Do you think those rules are real?" I asked. He sipped his drink, his gaze fixed on the dark forest. "I don't know, but I do know one thing. When you're in a new place, it's better to be safe than sorry." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words settling over me. That night, everything changed. It was just past midnight when I woke up to the sound of barking. Our dog, Max, was going crazy downstairs. At first, I thought he'd just seen a deer or something, but then I remembered rule number 4. Bring your pets in at night. "Max?" I whispered, climbing out of bed. The barking grew louder, more frantic. I crept downstairs, heart pounding. Max was at the sliding glass door, growling at something in the yard. I couldn't see much in the dark, but there was a faint movement near the tree line. "Ryan?" Dad's voice startled me. He was standing at the top of the stairs, his rifle in hand. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I said. "Something's out there." He came down quickly, his expression grim. "Get away from the door." "But now." I stepped back as he unlocked the gun cabinet. Mom appeared a moment later, clutching Dylan's hand. "Stay upstairs," Dad told her. "Lock the door." He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it. A low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. Dad turned to me, his face pale. "Go upstairs. Now." I didn't argue with Dad. Something about the look in his eyes, fear mixed with determination, told me this was no time to play tough guy. I grabbed Dylan's arm and dragged him upstairs, Mom following close behind. "Get in my room," I whispered, ushering them inside. Mom locked the door, her hands trembling as she pulled Dylan close. "What's going on, Ryan?" Dylan asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I admitted, glancing out the window. "But Dad seems to think it's serious." From our vantage point, we could see the yard faintly lit by the moonlight. Shadows danced among the trees, but nothing moved. I held my breath, hoping whatever was out there would just go away. Then we heard it again. The growl. It was deeper this time. Closer. Dylan pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging up the glass. "Ryan, what is that?" he whispered. "I don't know, but get back," I said, pulling him away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Downstairs, Dad moved like a man on a mission. Through the thin walls, I could hear him muttering to himself as he loaded his rifle. A faint creak echoed through the house as he cracked open the sliding door just enough to step out onto the porch. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him not to go out there, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I crouched by the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. The yard was eerily still, the only movement coming from the swaying trees in the distance. Dad stood on the porch, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the moon. He held the rifle steady, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. Something stepped into the clearing, a shadowy figure, hunched and grotesque. Its limbs were too long, its posture all wrong, like it was barely holding itself together. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like a predator's. Dad froze, his grip tightening on the rifle. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him. For a moment, it didn't move. Then it let out a blood-curdling screech, the sound ripping through the night like nails on a chalkboard. "Get back!" Dad shouted, raising the rifle. He fired once, the shot echoing through the forest. The creature jerked back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out another screech and darted toward the tree line, disappearing into the shadows. Dad didn't lower the rifle until long after it was gone. Upstairs, we sat in stunned silence, the sound of the gunshot still ringing in our ears. Mom held Dylan tightly, whispering reassurances that didn't match the fear in her eyes. "What was that thing?" Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. But I don't think it's just some animal. A few minutes later, Dad came upstairs, his face pale and drawn. He set the rifle down carefully and closed the door behind him. "It's gone," he said, his voice low. "For now." "What was it?" Mom asked, her voice shaking. Dad hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but it wasn't natural." He looked at me and Dylan, his expression grim. "From now on, we follow those rules. No exceptions." The next day at school, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the events of the night before, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the shadows and adrenaline had played tricks on me, but the growls, the screech, the way it moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. At lunch, I sat with Nick, Tyler, and James again. This time, I wasn't in the mood for small talk. "All right," I said, slamming my tray down. "What's the deal with the cryptids?" Nick blinked at me. "Cryptids? Dude, what are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice low. "The things in the woods, the ones those rules are supposed to protect us from." Tyler snorted. "Man, you sound like my grandpa. He used to go on and on about the creatures in the dark." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "You saw one, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Last night, my dad shot at it." Nick let out a low whistle. "Well, congrats, man. You're officially part of the club." "What club?" I asked. "The club of people who know this town is messed up," Nick said. "Look, you're new, so let me give you some advice. Don't go looking for answers. Just follow the rules and keep your head down." "That's it?" I asked, incredulous. "We're just supposed to accept it?" James shrugged. "Unless you want to end up like the Hendersons." "Who?" Dylan, who had been sitting quietly beside me, finally spoke up. Tyler's grin faltered. "They used to live near the edge of town. Didn't take the rules seriously. One night, they didn't bring their dog inside. Next morning, the whole family was gone. House was wrecked. Blood everywhere." My stomach turned. "And nobody did anything?" James shook his head. "There's nothing you can do." That night, Dad took extra precautions. He installed motion sensor lights around the property and set up cameras on the porch. We brought Max inside long before sunset and triple-checked every lock on the doors and windows. Despite all the preparations, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. At midnight, the radio turned on again. The sound of static pulled me out of a restless sleep. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the cabin, it might as well have been a scream. My eyes shot open, and for a second I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again, the low, crackling hum coming from downstairs. The radio. I sat up, heart pounding. The memory of Dad reading the rules aloud flashed in my mind. If the radio comes on randomly after dark, grab a weapon. They're close. They're close. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat I kept next to my bed and tiptoed toward the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. "Ryan?" Dylan's whisper startled me. He was standing in his doorway, clutching a flashlight. "Go back to bed," I hissed. "I heard it too," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm not staying in there by myself." "Fine, but stay behind me." I led him down the hall, our footsteps muffled by the thick wooden floorboards. When we reached the stairs, I stopped, straining my ears. The static was louder now, interspersed with faint whispers, garbled words I couldn't make out. "What is it saying?" Dylan whispered. "I don't know," I said, gripping the bat tighter. "Stay quiet." Downstairs, the living room was bathed in pale moonlight. The radio sat on the kitchen counter, its dials glowing faintly as the static shifted and warped. I glanced toward Dad's rifle, propped up in the corner by the fireplace, but I knew better than to fire a shot without knowing what I was aiming at. "Ryan." Dylan tugged on my sleeve, his voice trembling. "The window." I followed his gaze and froze. Something was outside. A dark, hulking shape moved slowly past the living room window, its outline just barely visible through the curtains. It stopped, its head tilting as if it were listening. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice us. Then the radio's static changed. The garbled whispers grew louder, more urgent, like a warning. The thing outside turned its head toward the sound, its glowing eyes piercing through the glass. "Get down," I whispered, pulling Dylan to the floor. The creature moved closer, its long fingers pressing against the window pane. I could see it more clearly now. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its jaw unnaturally wide. It pressed its face to the glass, sniffing the air like a bloodhound on a scent. Dylan whimpered, and I clamped a hand over his mouth. The creature froze, its head snapping toward us. My heart felt like it was going to explode. "Stay still," I mouthed, barely breathing. The thing let out a low growl, then turned and slinked away into the shadows. I didn't move until the sound of its footsteps faded completely. "Is it gone?" Dylan whispered. "For now," I said. "Come on, we need to wake Dad." Dad didn't take long to act. Within minutes, he was downstairs, fully dressed and armed. He turned off the radio and peered out the window, his jaw tight. "They're testing us," he said. "What does that mean?" Mom asked, holding Max tightly. The dog was shaking, his ears flat against his head. "They're seeing how far they can go," Dad said, his voice grim. "They've never come this close before. Something's changed." He turned to me and Dylan. "From now on, we take shifts at night. Nobody goes outside after dark, and if anything happens, you wake me immediately." "What are we dealing with?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What are they?" Dad hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the window. "I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances." The next day at school, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Everyone seemed on edge, their eyes darting to the windows like they were expecting something to come crashing through. Even the teachers were quieter than usual, their cheerful facades cracking under the weight of whatever was happening in town. At lunch, I cornered James in the hallway. "You need to tell me what's going on." "I already told you," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Follow the rules and you'll be fine." "That's not good enough," I snapped. "What are they? Why is nobody doing anything about this?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I don't know what they are. Nobody does. All we know is they've been here for as long as anyone can remember. The rules are the only thing keeping us alive." "Why doesn't anyone just leave?" I asked. "Some people have," he said quietly. "They don't get far." That night, Dad set up a watch schedule. He took the first shift, sitting by the window with his rifle while the rest of us tried to sleep. I didn't expect to get any rest, but exhaustion eventually caught up with me. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of a low, steady growl. It wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from outside my bedroom window. Slowly, I turned my head. My heart nearly stopped. The creature was back, its grotesque face pressed against the glass. Its glowing eyes bored into mine, its breath fogging up the window. I bit back a scream, forcing myself to stay still. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The radio downstairs crackled to life. When the radio crackled to life for the second night in a row, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the bat and bolted downstairs, nearly colliding with Dad on the way. "It's back," I said, my voice shaking. "Outside my window." Dad didn't waste time asking questions. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for me to follow. "Get the lights on," he said to Mom, who was standing frozen in the doorway. "And keep Dylan close." Max barked furiously, pacing near the front door, his tail between his legs. I flipped on every light in the house, bathing the yard in a harsh artificial glow. But even with the extra visibility, the woods beyond our property remained an impenetrable wall of darkness. "Do you see anything?" I asked, clutching the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Not yet," Dad said, scanning the tree line. His expression was calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his finger hovered just above the trigger. The radio cut off abruptly, plunging the house into an eerie silence. For a few agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as I was starting to think the creature had left, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. "There," Dad whispered, raising the rifle. I held my breath as the figure stepped into the light. It was taller than the one we'd seen before, its skeletal frame swaying unnaturally as it moved. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its glowing eyes locked onto us. Dad didn't wait for it to come closer. He fired once, the sound splitting the night. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and darted back into the woods. "Did you hit it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't think so," Dad said, lowering the rifle. "But it won't be back tonight." I wanted to believe him, but something told me this wasn't over. The next day, the tension in town was palpable. News spread quickly. Several families had reported similar encounters, and rumors of missing pets and livestock were rampant. Even the teachers seemed rattled, their usual routines disrupted by whispered conversations and worried glances. Dylan, ever the optimist, tried to focus on the upcoming hockey game. "It's going to be awesome," he said as we drove to school. "The whole town's coming out. You're still coming, right?" "Yeah," I said, though my enthusiasm was lacking. After everything that had happened, the idea of being surrounded by people in a brightly lit rink felt like a small comfort. That evening, the high school hockey rink was packed. The crowd's energy was contagious, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of normalcy. Dylan was on the ice, skating circles around his teammates during warm-ups, while Dad chatted with another parent in the stands. "See?" Mom said, nudging me. "It's nice to get out, isn't it?" "Sure," I said, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Halfway through the second period, it happened. The overhead lights flickered once, then twice, before plunging the rink into darkness. The crowd fell silent, the hum of the generators dying along with the lights. I reached for my phone, but before I could turn on the flashlight, the radio crackled to life. Not the PA system, the radio. The same static-filled, garbled whispers I'd heard the night before echoed through the rink, bouncing off the walls like a sinister warning. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the growing static. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the exit. "Stay close," he said, "and keep quiet." The crowd erupted into chaos as people fumbled for their phones, the faint beams of light casting eerie shadows across the ice. Somewhere in the darkness, a child screamed, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. "They're here," Dad said, his voice grim. "What do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "We stick together," he said, pulling Mom and Dylan close. "And we don't stop moving." The first creature appeared near the concession stand, its hulking form illuminated by the faint glow of someone's phone. It moved quickly, its long limbs propelling it across the floor with unnatural grace. The screams intensified as people scrambled to get away, but the creature didn't seem interested in the crowd. It was searching for something, or someone. "Over here!" Dad hissed, motioning for us to follow him into a nearby classroom. We squeezed inside, locking the door behind us. A family of 4 was already huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. "Is that a gun?" the other father asked, his eyes widening as he noticed Dad's handgun. "Yes," Dad said, "and I hope I don't have to use it." The man nodded, pulling a pistol from his jacket. "Good. We'll hold them off if they get too close." I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear what was happening outside. The sounds of footsteps and muffled growls grew louder, interspersed with the occasional scream. I could feel the weight of the bat in my hands, its metal cool against my skin. "Ryan," Dylan whispered, his voice shaking. "What if they find us?" "They won't," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The creatures didn't stop at the door. They moved through the school like a storm, shattering windows and ripping apart lockers. At one point, I thought I saw one of them pause near our classroom, its glowing eyes scanning the hallway. My heart stopped as it sniffed the air, its claws scraping against the doorframe. But then it moved on, disappearing into the darkness. After what felt like hours, the sounds outside finally began to fade. Dad motioned for us to stay put as he cracked open the door, his rifle at the ready. The hallway was empty, littered with debris and overturned chairs. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low. "Stay close and don't make a sound." We made our way through the school, stepping over shattered glass and broken furniture. Outside, the parking lot was eerily quiet, the faint glow of headlights illuminating the scattered remains of what had once been a normal night. We weren't the only ones who had survived. A small group of people had gathered near the edge of the lot, their faces pale and shell-shocked. "Let's go," Dad said, ushering us toward the truck. "We're not staying here." As we drove away, I glanced back at the darkened school. The creatures were gone, for now, but something told me this was just the beginning. The drive home was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of us. Dylan sat in the back seat, clutching Max tightly, while Mom stared out the window, her face pale and expressionless. Dad kept his eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel and the other resting on his rifle. The cabin came into view, its lights glowing like a beacon against the darkness. As we pulled into the driveway, Dad spoke for the first time. "We can't stay here much longer," he said. "Not if this keeps escalating." Mom turned to him, her voice trembling. "Where would we go? The town isn't safe, and the roads. What if they're out there too?" Dad didn't answer. He just parked the truck and got out, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. "Get inside," he said, "and lock the doors." Once inside, Dad went into full survival mode. He reinforced the windows with plywood, double-checked the locks, and set up traps around the perimeter of the cabin. Mom tried to comfort Dylan, who hadn't said a word since we left the school, while I helped Dad unpack the emergency supplies he'd stored in the basement. "Do you think they'll come here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They already have," Dad said, his jaw tight. "And they will again. We just have to be ready." The first attack came just after midnight. The radio blared to life, the garbled static filling the cabin like a siren. Max started barking, his growls low and menacing. Before we could react, a loud crash echoed from the front porch. "They're here," Dad said, grabbing his rifle. "Ryan, stay with your mother and Dylan. Don't open the door unless I say so." I nodded, gripping the baseball bat tightly as he stepped outside. The sounds of growling and shattering wood filled the air, followed by a deafening gunshot. "Get back!" Dad shouted, his voice strained. Through the window I could see him standing on the porch, firing into the darkness. One of the creatures lunged at him, its claws swiping inches from his face. He fired again, and the thing let out a guttural screech before collapsing onto the ground. "Ryan, upstairs!" Mom yelled, dragging Dylan toward the staircase. I followed, my heart pounding as the sounds of the battle raged on below. From the second-floor window, I could see more of them emerging from the woods. There were at least 5, their pale skeletal frames moving with horrifying speed. Dad fired shot after shot, but for every one he hit, another seemed to take its place. "They're going to break in," Mom whispered, her voice shaking. "No, they won't," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Dad's got this." The radio's static grew louder, morphing into a distorted voice that seemed to echo through the entire house. "You can't hide forever." Just as one of the creatures reached the porch, Dad yelled for us to get down. The motion sensor lights around the property suddenly flared to life, bathing the yard in a blinding glow. The creatures recoiled, their screeches piercing the night as they retreated into the woods. Dad stumbled back inside, slamming the door behind him. He was out of breath, his hands shaking as he reloaded the rifle. "The lights worked," he said, his voice hoarse. "But they'll be back." The second wave came an hour later. This time they attacked from all sides, throwing themselves against the windows and clawing at the doors. The cabin shook under their assault, the sound of splintering wood filling the air. Dad and I held them off as best we could, firing through the windows and using whatever we could find as weapons. At one point, a creature managed to break through the kitchen window, its long, clawed hand reaching inside. I swung the bat with all my strength, smashing its arm and sending it retreating back into the night. "They're testing us," Dad said, reloading his rifle, trying to find a weakness. Well, we're not giving them one, I said, wiping sweat from my brow. The attacks continued into the early hours of the morning. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the creatures had retreated, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The cabin was battered but still standing, and for the first time in hours, the radio was silent. "We made it," Mom said, her voice filled with equal parts relief and exhaustion. "Barely," Dad said, slumping into a chair. "But this isn't over." The day after the attack, Dad's determination was like a force of nature. He didn't waste time mourning the damage to the cabin or the sleepless night we'd all endured. By sunrise, he was on the phone, rallying every ex-military contact and outdoorsman in the area. By mid-morning, trucks began pulling into our driveway. Men and women stepped out, armed with rifles, bows, and enough supplies to outfit a small militia. Some wore old military jackets, others flannel and hunting gear, but they all had the same steely determination in their eyes. One of the men, a grizzled veteran named Harris, clapped Dad on the shoulder. "Heard you had quite the encounter last night." "Understatement," Dad said, shaking his hand. "We've got a problem on our hands and it's not going away. We need to make sure it stops here." Dad gathered everyone around the dining table, which was now covered in a hand-drawn map of the property. He pointed to the perimeter where the motion sensors were already set up. "We're going to expand the system," he said. "I've got extra sensors, floodlights, and cameras. We'll wire the whole property. If anything so much as breathes near us tonight, we'll know about it." "What about weapons?" Harris asked. "We've got enough ammo to hold them off for a while," Dad said. "But we need more than firepower. They're fast, and they're smart. We need traps." One of the locals, a burly hunter named Jack, grinned. "I've got bear traps and snares that'll do the trick. Just tell me where to set them." Another man, a wiry survivalist named Cole, chimed in. "We can use fire, torches, Molotovs, anything to scare them off." Dad nodded. "Good, let's get to work." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. While Dad and Harris worked on wiring the sensors and floodlights, Jack and Cole set up traps around the property. Dylan and I helped carry supplies, while Mom kept everyone fed and hydrated. By the time the sun began to set, the cabin looked like a fortress. Every window was boarded up, every door reinforced. Floodlights were positioned around the yard, and the motion sensors were calibrated to trigger an alarm if anything approached. Despite the preparations, a heavy tension hung in the air. Everyone knew what was coming. It started around midnight. The radio crackled to life, the static piercing the silence like a warning bell. Dad grabbed his rifle and signaled for everyone to take their positions. The motion sensors lit up, their shrill alarms cutting through the night. One by one, the floodlights flicked on, casting harsh beams of light across the yard. Shadows flickered at the edge of the forest, and then they emerged. Dozens of them. The creatures moved like a swarm, their grotesque forms darting between the trees. Their glowing eyes reflected the floodlights, making them look like demons out of a nightmare. "Hold your fire," Dad shouted. "Wait until they're in range." The first creature stepped into the clearing, its claws gleaming in the light. Harris was the first to shoot, his rifle cracking like thunder. The creature let out a screech and collapsed, but more were right behind it. "Here they come," Jack yelled, loosing an arrow that struck another creature square in the chest. The next few minutes were pure chaos. Gunfire erupted as the creatures charged the cabin, their screeches mingling with the shouts of the defenders. One of them triggered a bear trap, its legs snapping with a sickening crunch. Another was caught in a snare, flailing wildly before Harris finished it off with a clean shot. "They're coming from the east!" someone shouted. Dad turned and fired, dropping two more creatures that had gotten too close. I stayed near Dylan, clutching my bat and praying I wouldn't have to use it. The floodlights flickered as the creatures tested the traps, their movements calculated and deliberate. It was clear they weren't just mindless beasts. They were hunting us. For every creature we took down, it seemed like two more appeared. One of them managed to get past the traps, leaping onto the porch with terrifying speed. Before I could react, Harris stepped forward and shot it point blank, its body collapsing in a heap. "They're not giving up," Dad muttered, reloading his rifle. We need to end this. That's when Cole lit the first torch. He tossed it into the woods, the flames erupting into a bright, blazing wall. The creatures recoiled, their screeches turning into howls of fury. "Fireworks!" Cole yelled. "Keep 'em back!" The hunters grabbed more torches, throwing them into the forest and forcing the creatures to retreat. The combination of light, fire, and sheer determination was enough to tip the scales in our favor. As dawn approached, the attacks began to wane. The surviving creatures slinked back into the woods, their glowing eyes disappearing one by one. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the yard was littered with their bodies. We stood in silence, the weight of the night settling over us. The hunters and ex-military men looked at each other, their faces grim but victorious. "We did it," Dad said, lowering his rifle. "At least for now." The survivors gathered in the living room, their exhaustion evident. Harris poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands still shaking. "This isn't over," he said. "They'll be back." Dad nodded. "But next time, we'll be ready." For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had fought back and survived, and while the threat wasn't gone, we knew how to defend ourselves. As the group began to disperse, Dad put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, Ryan," he said. "I'm proud of you." I didn't feel brave, but I nodded anyway. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, looking out at the forest. "We make sure they never catch us off guard again."